Right, let's get more on this now. From Tim Dawson, he's the Deputy General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. Tim, dark times for journalists involved in Gaza. The numbers are, they're really concerning. More than 100 journalists. It's hard to imagine how that's even possible. First thoughts are, it could be accidental. It could be because it's indiscriminate bombing and Israel isn't too concerned about who gets hit. It's also possible it could be deliberate and targeted. I've got no evidence to support that, though. I guess that's what an ICC investigation would look at. What's your take on this?
It's very hard to sustain the possibility that this is simple chance. It's absolutely true. There has been significant indiscriminate bombing with very, very large 2,000-pound bombs in Gaza. However, when you look at the numbers that have died, the mortality rate among journalists, it's almost impossible to believe that it is accidental. So, for example, something like 2.8% of health workers in Gaza have lost their lives. Something like 1% of teachers in Gaza have lost their lives. Something like 10% of journalists have lost their lives. That's a scale of death that is really without comparison. Just to give one, the American Marine Corps in Vietnam, they were the soldiers involved in the most ferocious fighting. They lost 5% of their number during the 20 years they were engaged in Vietnam. Compare that with journalists in Gaza, and it's very difficult to believe that this is chance alone. Obviously, the intervention of the ICC is very welcome. It is something that the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, had indicated when he met with Palestinian journalists leaders at the beginning of December. I think that the rule of international law and the application of international law to these cases will potentially have an enormous impact, both in terms of bringing to justice those who, if they have been responsible for deliberate killing, have done so, but also in beginning to restore faith among Palestinians that they are not outside international law.
Obviously, being in a war zone, whatever your reason for being there, is a dangerous thing. But the number of deaths that we've seen, a lot of people watching might be thinking, why are they going there? For media organisations, why do they keep sending journalists? Why do the journalists, they go willingly, why do they keep going to war zones? Why is that an important thing to have a journalist on the ground?
Well, in the case of Gaza, it's worth emphasising that there are no international journalists there at all. None have been allowed in since the beginning of this conflict. Very few were allowed in before that. So the reporting we're seeing from Gaza is almost entirely from the 1,000 or so, now obviously 900 or so, Gazan journalists who were there and recording what they saw. I've spoken with many of them, and they've talked about their absolute dedication to reporting on what's happening to their neighborhoods, what has befallen their communities. They're doing so with almost no food, almost no water. They walk to do their assignments, carrying their cameras on their shoulders. So they are experiencing very significant privations in doing their work. I think for journalists more generally, covering war feels like a duty, feels like a responsibility. It's some of the most extreme points of human experience, and the ability to explain and show that to the rest of the world so that the rest of the world understands what's being done in our name is something that many journalists feel is their deepest responsibility. I think taken across the piece, that's why journalists respond. But I think the Gazan journalists are a special case in point.
For this question, I just want your particular opinion. It doesn't have to be backed up with any, kind of hard evidence, but I'm still curious what you think. War reporters, obviously, they get video, they get to speak to the victims, they get stories that otherwise would not be uncovered. If you're a nation fighting in a conflict, and it could be any of the many conflicts that are always taking place around the world, do you think there might be a temptation for a nation to think, we don't want that message getting out, it's not in our interest? Do you think it could be that cynical sometimes?
I'm sure that it is. I'm absolutely sure that it is. Clearly, people, waging war are desperately keen to control the message around what is happening. I think that's quite possibly what's happening here. My response is always, the more people who are reporting things, the more pictures we have, the better chance we have of understanding what's happening. Inevitably, some journalists are more keen on one story or another story. Some journalists are keen on highlighting privations suffered by one community rather than another. The more information we all have, the better we are able to understand. And whatever governments or anybody else throws up, whatever obstacles they throw up to try and prevent reporting coming out of somewhere, I think the responsibility that most journalists feel is that we should be doing our very best to get as much information, as much coverage, words, pictures, sounds out so that people get some understanding of what's happening.
Yep, certainly dangerous work, in particular in Gaza at the moment. Tim Dawson, really appreciate your take on this. He's the Deputy General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. Thank you.